what's up? Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Roll Pod, an Alabama sports podcast from Bama 247. I'm your host, Cody Goodwin. Got the whole gang here on this Monday morning, Alex Scarborough and Mike Rodak. We are going to continue our big questions series, I suppose. I say it's a series. It's really only like 2 podcasts. But last Thursday, if you guys listened, if you haven't, go check it out. It should be in your feed. We asked some way too early big questions regarding each position group on the offense, just kind of things to discuss as Alabama really pivots into the offseason, and we're about a month away from the beginning of spring football. So just some way too early big questions that we had about each offensive position group. We're going to continue that today with the defensive position group, some more big questions to kind of generate some way too early discussion about Alabama. But first, one thing we did not do last Thursday was have our usual Hoops Minute. We didn't really discuss Alabama basketball really at all last week. Alabama went 2-0 last week. They had a 103-87 win over Vanderbilt, an 80-73 win over LSU. They're now 17-3 overall this season, 6-1 in SEC play. Kind of the big takeaways from Alabama hoops last week. We saw some offense against Vanderbilt. We saw some defense against LSU. We didn't see Mark Sears at all in the second half of Saturday's game. Mike, I'll pitch this to you first. What's kind of your big takeaway from Alabama hoops performance last week?
Did I freeze again?
You might have frozen again.
Right,
there we go. Okay.
I don't know why that's happening, but here we are. I don't know. People seem to kind of fall different ways on the Mark Sears thing. There's people who say, like, how can you put your best player in the bench for a close game like that? You know, the SEC's leading scorer. If you feel like, you know, if Oates says, I put the best players out there to help us win in the second half, there's some people who say, like, oh, you know, how can you not have a guy like Mark Sears out there as part of that equation? But if you pay attention to everything Nate Oates has said for not just this season, but even going back to previous seasons, I can think of a year when Javon Quinterly got benched for a game at Vandy, and Oates brought in Britton Johnson, a walk-on off the bench, because he wanted better effort defensively out of that game, and that's what he got. And this is not something new. You know, it's been Oates has really questioned Mark Sears' defensive effort. Even I go back to the Auburn game last year when they lost at Auburn, and that was something he mentioned after that game. And it's something he's intermittently mentioned this season. He has said that it's gotten better at times, but this was not one of those times when it was looking better in the first half. And honestly, I don't think it has as much to do with Sears going 0 for 5 in the first half. I think, you know, it's probably part of the thinking, but what Nate is looking for is defensive effort and kind of taking the game in a way that doesn't matter who the opponent is, doesn't matter what the game situation is, you're just going to go hard. And I don't know if that was what he was getting from Mark Sears. And so that's why he sat him in the second half. I mean, might he have been sick or whatever? Sure. But if that was the reason why Nate didn't play him in the second half, Nate would have said that. He said that about a lot of guys. A lot of guys have been sick over the years, and he's always kind of talked about in graphic detail. He was thrown up last night or whatever the case may be. There's none of that with Mark Sears. It was very, I don't want to say curt, but it was a very concise response from Nate on that particular topic, and that kind of tells you everything you need to know. So that's who he is as a coach. Like, he's not going to just put a guy on a pedestal because he's a preseason All-American and SEC's leading scorer. If he feels like there's a better player out there to give him better effort, then he'll do that. And in this case, that's what they're getting from Aiden Holloway. I mean, his shooting has been better, but I feel like Oates has really been complimenting him for getting better on defense. I think he's always been very complimentary of LeBaron Philon's defense. I think the shooting and getting into the gym has been a discussion about him. And then Chris Youngblood is also a guy that Nate Oates seems to love and loves everything about him, says he could be a coach on the staff one day. And that's 3 guards right there. So that's all you really need in the second half. If Mark Sears wasn't giving you what you wanted, then you have other players to play. And Nate also loves Mohamed Diabate and the way he plays. And that's the sort of player he wanted on the court in the second half. And there's nothing too surprising about that to me, even though on the surface somebody might say, how can you benchmark Sears? But I think he got what he wanted out of it, which was a better defensive performance in the second half, and ultimately that led to a win.
Yeah, for those who may have missed it, although I'd be shocked if any Alabama fans who regularly follow basketball missed this. Mark Sears held scoreless against LSU, finished 0 for 5 shooting, did have 3 boards, 3 assists, also 3 turnovers, but only played 17 minutes, did not play at all in the second half against LSU. He was seen on the bench. SEC Network made a thing about it. Wasn't injured. Nate Oates came out immediately in his post-game presser and said, "We just played the guys we thought would give us the best chance to win in the second half." And he more or less doubled down on that when we asked again, just for clarification. I wrote my thoughts out on Sunday morning because I saw that people were still talking about it, so I posted that on Bama 247. You can go read that. Alex, what did you make of the Mark Sears thing?
I was going to say, is it that weird that a program that brought in as much depth as it did, that values blue collar as much as Nate Oates does, if he didn't do it, it would be weird. Now it's odd that, we're in a position, we were talking 2 months ago, who's going to get squeezed from the lineup at guard because there's so many of them. None of us picked Mark Sears to be that guy. But if you're not going to play defense on a team that really doesn't overall struggle to score points, you're the kind of the odd man out. So you've got to figure out a way to pick up that part of your game. There are going to be games where they need him to be a shot maker. But on a game where he's a liability on defense and they can get their way to the bucket, he's going to have problems. So he's got to figure out that part of the game. And honestly, it's his path. It's his cleanest path to the pros anyways. So I think Mike's right. It's probably more effort than anything. So you got to see that moving forward. But, it's a long season. He's a guy who's been playing for a very long time. Maybe he just had an off night, but you want to see him, how he responds over these next few games.
The other thing too is, and this is more thinking big picture just for Mark's case, like he did the whole NBA thing last year where he kind of dipped his toe in the water and got some feedback. And if I remember correctly, Mike, you might be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the biggest things was just his defensive effort and just, can you guard? Like he's kind of short. He'd be a little bit primary shooter kind of on the outside if he were to get to the next level. But you got to be more than that if you want to play consistently at the next level. And the biggest feedback he got back was that he needed to focus a little bit more defensively. And we have seen that from him at times this season. But there are other times where, and Nate kind of alluded to this, like he needs to see that, and Alabama needs to show that they can do that on a regular, consistent basis at a high level. And if, this team is deep enough that if Mark Sears ain't going to do it, Nate's going to put him on the bench. So that's, I think it's a twofold thing. And I wrote this too, just in more depth. I won't go into too much depth here, but like one, it's a shot at Mark, like whatever standard Nate's holding him to, he's not meeting that, or he did not meet that on Saturday. But also it's a pretty loud statement to the rest of the team too, that like, look, I don't care how good you are. You can be Mark Sears. I will put you on the bench if you're not playing at a high level.
Yeah. And it wasn't just him either. I mean, that's, obviously, it's elevated because it's Mark Sears and he's a bigger profile player and he didn't play the entire second half. But Cliff Amore also did not start the second half of the game. And Nate, it was either his press conference or his radio thing, basically said, like, we looked at the defensive leverage numbers from the first half, and those were the two guys that we pulled out based on those defensive numbers. So Amore, in that case, ended up coming in and playing better in the second half. And that's what Nate was kind of pointing to when I think he got asked at the end, like, what does Mark need to do to get back in, and essentially said, look at what Cliff did. Like, you take the coaching and you get better from it. So it's tricky because you only have so many minutes to go around. You have 40 minutes times 5 players, and there's other players that are playing better, to be honest. Like Aiden Holloway deserves to be on the court more than he has been. He's playing as good as anybody in the team right now.
Double figures in 8 of his last 9 games for Aiden Holloway, by the way. He's been great.
Right. And I think Oates really likes what he's getting defensively from Jaron Stevenson. I think he, like I mentioned before, really just likes Chris Youngblood, even though he's still not shooting all that great. I think he still likes LeBaron Philon. So you get Darion Reed back at some point here. Like there's just not enough minutes to go around, and you have a very deep team, and you kind of have the ability to shift around some resources. So, I don't know if it will change the starting lineup going forward. Because Oates doesn't always think that way. Like the 5 guys that are out there may not be your 5 best players, and really they're not the 5 best. They're not the 5 highest minute players either. That often is not the case. So Diabate could be on the floor more than Grant Nelson or more than Amore, and Holloway could be out there as much as Sears or whatever the case may be. So that's another thing that Nate wanted is leadership from the fifth year guys was something he's been calling out lately. Obviously pointing that directly at Sears and Nelson, I think more than anybody else. Probably Youngblood is in that category too, and Omore too. But they're also new to the program. And if he felt like there wasn't enough leadership to play the right way against LSU after they had the debacle against Ole Miss, and he wanted them to basically not do the same thing again, and he saw the same thing, I think that's probably where some of that disappointment or frustration with Sears, comes from. So it's going to be interesting because they have a lot of good players, and they don't have to play Mark Sears 35 to 40 minutes a game. They don't have to. I don't know if they need to do that to win. So we'll see what they do.
It'd be really weird if he turned to a six-man off the bench who shoots a bunch of threes.
Right.
That happens. I wonder, you guys have followed the program more closely than I have over the last few years. Is there any fear of this becoming a thing in a bad way? Because this is the second time it's been a pretty public failure for a veteran on this team, a guy who's seen as a leader. Again, I think Nate is doing what he's supposed to do, but you combine that with what we've seen from his mom speaking out on social media. Like, is there any concern that this becomes a problem?
I mean, without being in the locker room, it's always hard to say. I mean, there was definitely issues on the team 3 years ago. The Shackelford, Quinterly team, JD Davidson, that team did not really get along with each other. And Nate made that clear. And then I think he really liked what he got out of last year's team. We always heard about Mudita. We haven't really heard as much about Mudita this year. And yeah, I mean, your mind can wander a little bit, and knowing that this is the end of the road for Mark Sears and knowing that this is the end of the road for Grant Nelson, like Nate says, like these guys look at where they're ranked, NBA draft rankings. They are still not in the draftable range, if you will. ESPN has them like 80, 90th in the country in terms of the prospects for this draft. And knowing that they have less than 2 months perhaps left in their college careers, does that play into their thinking on the court, trying to position themselves individually? It's again, your mind can wander to that place. I don't know how true that is, but this was always going to be a tricky team to navigate for Nate. I think we could probably have talked about this in September or October. Like, you have a lot of guys on this team, and there just was never going to be enough minutes to go around. And if Nate stays true to his word, which I think he is in this case, that if you don't play hard defensively, he's going to put you on the bench. That's what he's always said as a coach. If you stay true to your word, you have a situation like this. How does that resonate through the locker room? And he has talked about leadership lacking on this team to some degree. So yeah, I mean, there's different small red flags that have popped up. I don't know if there's any glaring issue, but there's still a month left in the season. We'll just have to see where it goes. But I think any coach, whether it's football, basketball, any sport, especially high profile cases like this, is obviously going to think twice about any sort of move like this, because there's always the downside. There's always the locker room aspect of it. So how that exactly works in this case, I don't know. I don't know if anybody knows the answer to that. I think it's just something that has to play out.
Yeah, I think Nate has probably earned the benefit of the doubt when it comes to hard coaching decisions like this. Like, not only just because he has a track record of doing it, but also that track record also includes a Final Four and a couple of SEC regular season and a couple of tournament titles. So he knows what he's doing. Any other thoughts on the Tide this past week, or was it really just the whole Mark Sears thing on Saturday that kind of?
I mean, the Sears thing's the big thing, but
right.
It's just you sense a little bit of a shift in what this team is. Where coming into the season, you think like it's all about Mark Sears, it's all about Grant Nelson. You have Cliff Amore as the rim protector. At that point, we thought we were going to have Latrell Wrightsell playing, and it's different now. Like, again, I think Aiden Holloway, Mohamed Diabate are playing better than anybody else on this team right now. I think Cliff Amore has a role, but I don't know if it's as dominant, if it's as extensive as maybe we thought it might be. I think Grant Nelson has kind of faded a little bit, but he's certainly capable of having some big games and kind of turning it on. His shot is still not there, which is problematic for him as far as the draft, because that's always been the biggest thing. You kind of get what you get from Jaron Stevenson. The offense is obviously not really there for him, and if Youngblood can hit a few more shots, if Philon's shot can kind of come back, they're going to be very, very dangerous. But as I've said all along, there's enough flaws on this team. There's problems with turnovers. There's problems with rebounding sometimes. There's problems with three-point shooting. There's problems with defense sometimes. Like, it's just a matter of how many of those come together in a single game in March, and does that end their season or not? At this point, you always get to February in college basketball. You're like, all right, just let's move on to the next chapter. Let's fast forward and let's see what happens in March, because we know they're going to make it. We know they're going to be a very high seed. They could be a 1 seed. They could be a 2 seed. At this point, it's like, let's just fast forward and see how the movie ends.
We'll see. That was the Hoops Minute. Again, Alabama back in action on Wednesday against Mississippi State in Starkville. I believe that's an 8 p.m. tip-off on SEC Network. Late game on Wednesday, but should be a fun game. Top 15, top 20 matchup. We are now going to pivot back to some football talk, continue our big questions series, this time with the defense like we did on the last show. Had some big, way too early questions about Alabama's offensive position groups, just to kind of spark a little bit more discussion as we navigate the quote-unquote off-season here. We're going to do the same thing that we did last show, but with the defensive position groups this time. We divvied them out in the group chat before we hopped on the pod today. And we're going to start, Alex, with you and the defensive line. What's your big, way too early question regarding Alabama's 2025 D-line?
It's kind of a twofold question. I'm mildly interested in, can James Smith pick up the slack where Tim Smith leaving, because he did become a very good and dependable defensive lineman. But I think more important than that is, can a solid defensive line create more pressure and be more disruptive? 3.5 sacks from the group that's coming back. We can talk about James Smith, Tim Keenan, Edric Hill, Jeremiah Beeman. 2.5 of those sacks came from Tim Keenan last year. 3 tackles for loss from James Smith and Tim Keenan. That's it. They can be good against the run, but can they get into the backfield? Can they be more disruptive and take some of the pressure off the edge guys who've underperformed a little bit? But I'd like to see somebody step up into that role. Does James, with more reps, become that guy? Does somebody like Edric Hill or Jeremiah Beeman, with more opportunity, period, become that guy? But somebody has to, because it's been a long time since Alabama's had a really good interior pass rush.
I am particularly high on James Smith. Some fun PFF stats for those that care about such things. Both James Smith and Tim Smith finished the season with 11 total quarterback pressures, and Tim Smith played 150 more snaps than James Smith did. So I'm on the James Smith bandwagon. I think he's a guy that with more reps and more opportunity, we could see. I think it's fair to say we could probably see a breakout season. I don't know how dominant that would be for him, but I think jumping from, if you give him another 150 snaps, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that he could get into that 25-30 pressure range over the course of the season, which would really help a guy like LT Overton, who is the returning pressure leader for Alabama, would really help a guy like Tim Keenan, who I think was commanding a few more double teams because just folks didn't have to worry about a Dallas Turner or a Chris Braswell coming off the edge or a Justin Aboigbe in the middle of the defense. So if James Smith can take that next jump, I think that just really helps the whole operation. Mike, what do you think about kind of way too early thoughts about Alabama's D-line?
I mean, you need those two guys to stay healthy. I think that's the biggest position where if you have an injury, I feel like you're in a dire place. It's possible that Jeremiah Beeman, in that, like, Keenan or James Smith goes down, I think Beeman would be the first guy up. It's possible that he steps in and, kind of elevates his game to where he's been, or from where he's been right now. But there's a pretty big drop off there in terms of experience and just kind of overall gut feeling on how things would go. And, you lose a guy in the middle like that, either one of them, especially Keenan, probably. It automatically becomes really hard to week in and week out in the SEC sustain against the run. That would be my big question. If that, it's not often that the defensive tackle goes down, but you really are relying on those two guys unless you can find somebody in the portal in the spring. So they're thin. It's a very inexperienced group behind Keenan and James Smith, and maybe Stephen Bumua comes in out of JUCO and can help you right away. If he plays more inside than Bandit, which I've seen kind of speculated a little bit. We'll have to see how that shakes out. But
is that how you pronounce his name?
Bumua. I don't know. I mean,
Mbumua? I always thought it was Mbamoa, but I could be wrong.
Mbumua.
Mbamoa.
I don't know.
Alex, you want to get in on this pronunciation party?
No.
We're gonna get back to that in a second.
Yeah.
But Mbumua.
Mbamoa. I don't know.
I do
maybe.
think that if a guy, if D-line is one, and when you're talking about the portal in the spring, that if somebody comes along, they'll go looking. I just said every time I talk about this is probably the hardest position to find quality players because you have to pay through the nose in order to get them.
A question for the group, and I know we're talking specifically about the D-line. We'll touch on the outside linebackers and the Bandits as well as the defensive backs coming up here in a moment. But with all of the returning experience and talent in the secondary, could the defensive line benefit from the defensive backs being very good next year? Like, is that a possibility that could be entertained?
It could cover up for them, but I think every good defense has a strong defensive line. I've never seen a great defense without a good defensive line.
Yeah.
I've seen a great defense with some liabilities and pass coverage, but I've never seen the reverse.
I just like the idea of more coverage pressures or coverage sacks. Like, is that, I wonder if that's on the table for a defense like this, especially early in the season as the D-line tries to figure out rotation, personnel, that type of thing. Like, that's, as I was kind of preparing for this show, that was a thought that popped into my head.
Yeah. I mean, possibility, but not the route you want to go if you're Kane Womack.
I don't know. I'm trying to listen to an interview. Well, it's another Facebook. An interview he did with Football Canada, but it's also in French. Just try to.
How good's your French, Mike?
Those powder blue unis are sick, though. I'll say that.
The Montreal Alouettes.
Yeah.
And you ever covered a CFL game? I've covered a CFL game.
Not all of us lived on the border.
I covered not just a CFL game. I covered a CFL preseason game.
Johnny Manziel, right?
It was Johnny Manziel.
That is some true sicko stuff.
Hamilton Tiger Cats. 28.
Isn't Tiger Cat kind of redundant?
Cat.
Yeah.
Cat.
Yeah.
I guess. I mean, it's actually a pretty nice stadium. That was a fun little time. This is great radio.
This is a fun rabbit hole to go down.
It is.
They serve poutine?
No, but this was. There we go. This was me and Johnny Manziel doing a one-on-one.
How come you don't wear a tie for our show?
Because that's ESPN. It's elevated, you know. But I remember after that game,
thanks, bro.
He was like yelling and screaming at somebody because he didn't have like an Adidas suit to wear or something, and the PR guy was trying to figure out what was going on. But
there's a lot of stories.
I was only there for like 2 days, but
story journey.
It's a very Canadian thing that the Hamilton Tiger Cats play on Tim Hortons field. Just saying.
Oh, Tim Hortons is big in Canada, man.
That's what I'm saying.
Is Tim Hortons legit?
It's good. I mean, it's better than Dunkin' Donuts to me.
And that's your Canada minute.
That's Canadian minute. How does it compare to D's Beans, though? Shout out to Kentucky.
Ooh, D's Beans and D's
Butts barbecue in Kentucky.
That's right. We went to 2 different places before the Kentucky game last year. One of them was called D's Beans, and one of those was called D's Butts.
That was 2 years ago.
D's Beans had coffee. D's Butts had barbecue. It was they were both good. Like it was good stuff.
Were they owned by the same person?
I think so.
They had similar logos. Small town Kentucky shit. It was great.
There's your Kentucky minute.
That was the defensive line. Mike, you had the inside linebackers. What is your way too early question on Alabama's inside linebackers for 2025?
Playing time. Well, it's twofold. It's number one, when does Deontay Lawson return? Obviously, he's said that he won't be back until fall camp, but there's obviously different hurdles he's going to need to clear in his rehab. He's still pretty early on in it. You never really know until you get the final clearance and you're actually on the field again. So hopefully, for his sake, that happens in August. But is that guaranteed right now? I don't know. That's the first part of it, is when he's back and when is he back feeling fully healthy in himself again. That's also part of it. But how is the playing time distributed between him, Justin Jefferson, and Nakai Hill-Green, I think is really the big question. And, they dealt with that last year in terms of Jefferson, Jahad Campbell, and Lawson. I don't have the exact snap distribution. And obviously that gets skewed a little bit because Lawson missed, basically the last 3 games if you count the Oklahoma game. So, Jefferson still got on the field a good amount as a third linebacker. Even in the previous system under Saban and Kevin Steele, like they had a third linebacker and Trezman Marshall who got on the field a decent amount. So it's certainly doable. And I don't know if of those 3 guys, you have a guy like Jahad Campbell that you don't really want to take off the field a whole lot. I think, you're 3 guys that are good, but like you don't have an elite Campbell sort of player right there. So how those 3 kind of shake out, assuming Lawson keeps the helmet dot if he's out there and healthy, if he comes off the field, does that go to Jefferson? How does that all work? It's it's an interesting spot, but you could be pretty good there again. I think you have the potential having 3 veterans, 3 fifth-year guys, I do believe. You're pretty solid. It's just how much does each one play? What sort of situations? Are you going to play all 3 of them at the same time? We saw, I feel like, a little bit of that from Alabama this past year against some option sort of teams that were in a little bit closer. You could have Campbell on the outside and Jefferson and Lawson inside, kind of play a 4-3. We saw a little bit of that, so they try some of that again. Yeah, there's some questions there at that position, but I don't think there's much of a question in terms of who the top 3 guys are. Mm-hmm. You lose Justin Okoronkwo, and I think you had your potential competitor for a third option, kind of leave, through the door there.
Yeah, Caden Jones still around. I did look at the numbers. Jahad, 751 snaps, by far the most, 615 for Deontay Lawson, 412 for Justin Jefferson. So a lot of reps. I think you could kind of distill the question down to, does Justin Jefferson start? Mm-hmm. I wonder how it works. I think Deontay is obviously the wild card in all of this, and the timeline for his return. Nikhai Hill-Green is a really interesting player. Got to clean up some of the missed tackle things he had going on at Colorado, but a guy who could get into the backfield. I think he had double-digit tackles for loss. I don't think anybody at Alabama had more than 5 or 6, if I remember correctly. The interesting thing to me is if Lawson's fully healthy, what do they do with him? Because if you're looking for a guy that they can kind of move around, his pass rush numbers are pretty good. He's 3rd on the team in pressure percentage. He didn't rush the passer a whole lot. I think 65 snaps, but 18.5% of the time he was successful getting to the pass rusher. He only trailed Jahad and Q Robinson. So can you kind of move him around a little bit? I think that'd be really interesting. I think Kane's got 3 interesting pieces he can use. It's just going to be very telling to see how he wants to move those guys around.
Nikhai Hill-Green, 22 missed tackles. This according to Pro Football Focus. Justin Jefferson and Deontay Lawson combined for 20 missed tackles last season. So clean that up a little bit. You'd have a pretty good player. I mean, even despite that, 2nd team All Big 12 linebacker, if I remember correctly. The point about trying to replace Campbell, or at least trying to put somebody in that role, I wonder if that's what Deontay does this upcoming season. I also wonder if, mostly because he can be an effective pass rusher. He's fantastic when he comes in on blitzes. He's got that next level speed. I wonder about I don't know, they asked Campbell to do so much, and he was such a unique body type with really long arms, and he was, he came in as an edge defender, so he was pretty comfortable out there. Deontay Lawson has almost exclusively played in the middle throughout his entire career. So is he comfortable kind of playing like a quasi Wolf role? Is that something he's able to do? Honestly, I think if, this is a guy that's potentially looking at playing at the next level, that might be the best thing for him, just to show that he can do it and provide himself a little bit of versatility. And if he can be effective at it, I really think that opens the door for a lot of fun stuff that maybe Kane can do with the inside linebackers. Because then Justin Jefferson, I know over the last couple games of the season, pretty effective with the green dot. So if you want to do that and then kind of play with Deontay a little bit, or maybe you put Nikhai Hill-Green in that role. I don't know. They're all kind of roughly the same size, but just different body types from Campbell. I'm going to be really curious to see, one, if they try to do that, because, it's really hard to replace Jahad Campbell. And 2, if they do decide to do that, who ultimately is in that role. Having Jahad play Wolf on occasion opened up a lot, I thought, for the middle of the defense last year.
The only rub is it's kind of twofold. How does Justin hold up with significantly more snaps? He is an undersized guy. He seems to overcome it pretty well. Super athletic. But if you want to move Deontay around, does that mean you therefore have to take the green dot off of him? And do you really want to do that with the guy who's got your most experience in terms of reps, time in the system, all of those things? There are different ways you can play it. And the mic doesn't always have to have the green dot, but it's a good thing to have if that's how you want to do it. It's just it's Kane's in a good spot and probably a better spot than we expected 4 months ago, but he's still got a lot of questions to answer about how all the pieces fit together.
Which is what'll partially make this spring really, really intriguing. Just kind of what do they play with? What do they do? What are they going to experiment with? Especially with Deontay on the shelf until fall camp, they really might be limited in what they can do. But I think when you know what you have in one guy, you can kind of play with the other pieces in the meantime and maybe figure a few things out. I don't know. It could be kind of fun. Alex, back to you. You drew the combination of the outside linebackers, the Wolves, the Bandits. That's effectively the pass rushing unit, I suppose, of Alabama's front seven. What's a way too early big question you got for that group?
You're not going to believe this. The question is, can they get to the quarterback? Wow, who could have seen that coming? I mean, it's the same thing. I talk about it on every podcast. If they have to get to the quarterback and take him down, they had such trouble creating negative plays last year. They were underwhelming in terms of pressures, 11th in the SEC, not where you want to be.
No.
Sacks are even worse because they weren't bringing down the quarterback. LT Overton, very good player. He can close that gap. That makes up for a lot of the shortfall they have there. Does Kelby Collins provide that coming in from Florida, a guy who was playing what I think he would say was out of position last year? Can Jordan Renaud step up? I'm really high on Quay Rousseau at the Wolf position. I really liked what he did when he was healthy last year. Marion Latham, you expect him to play a little bit more Wolf. Yanze Pierre, another guy who we saw flash and then kind of go away in some moments. The development of that position is going to be huge because, again, as solid as the secondary is, and we'll talk more about that, you've got to do a better job of consistently getting the quarterback and not leaving those guys on an island.
25 sacks for Alabama last season, their fewest in quite a long time. I don't have the exact date up in front of me, but just kind of clicking through CFB stats, it has been a very hot minute since Alabama had that few sacks. And really, when you look at the way that the defense ultimately unfolded, I know early on in the season there were many different issues just with the secondary kind of figuring itself out, the linebackers kind of figuring out a solid rotation. The pass rush never really fully materialized at all last year. And that was really, like we've mentioned many times on this show, and Alex will continue to harp on it until he sees otherwise, that was really the only weakness in the defense by the time they got to the end of the season, I felt like, or at least in some of those bigger games at the end of the season. I'm thinking Tennessee wasn't really the end of the season, but I thought the defense overall, minus the pass rush, played pretty well in a game like that. So if they can figure that out, that seems like the pass rush is kind of the final piece to the puzzle here on defense. Mike, who do you think could be a potential answer to the pass rush issues if you're looking at way too early Alabama right now?
I feel like it has to be Overton. I mean, I don't know. Collins is probably the number 2 option. Like Renaud, I feel like is probably more of a run guy, just based on a little bit we've seen of him. Probably more than a guy who's going to get around the edge. Rousseau is interesting, but just with this defense and the way they play, like how many times is he actually putting his hand in the dirt on the edge and going after the quarterback? Sometimes you're setting the edge in the run game. Sometimes you're dropping back. Like you have different responsibilities at Wolf. So in terms of a guy like you just need to put out there and let him loose, like Overton, I feel like is the closest thing to that. So that's the guy I would point to, but it's still a question of how do they divide snaps between him, Collins, Renaud, Latham, Rousseau, Pierre, anybody beyond that, Justin Hill, Noah Carter, Keon Keeley, Stephen Bukuma, Cavante Henry, which let's not forget, JUCO guy coming in. He's not a young guy necessarily. Like you have a JUCO guy, you're expecting something a little bit sooner. You're not just going to stash him on the bench for a year and say like you're a freshman, because he's not. So does Cavante Henry get into that mix sooner? He's going to have to prove it. So a lot of different guys at those 2 spots. They have a lot of numbers at Wolf and Bandit. I think in a good amount of experience as well. It's just where's that top level sort of, again, 3rd and 8, you need to go and sack a quarterback and make a stop. Like, who's the guy to go and make that play? I think Overton is probably the closest thing to that.
And that's tough because he's a guy who plays with his hand in the dirt a lot. Like, you think about the best pass rushes they've had when they ran that cheetah package, they had 3 really good rushers who you could just turn loose on 3rd down. They don't really have that right now. They've got to get guys who can bring the speed, who can win one-on-one battles, who can be quick off the edge. And maybe there's somebody sitting around that we don't know about yet, but they've got a lot of players. I just don't know who that guy is. Again, to Mike's point, on an obvious pass rush, 3rd down, who's a guy you say, I think he can go get to the quarterback. Short of LT, there's not a guy who you think, yeah, he can go do that job.
And LT's bigger too, and that's kind of what they need out of that position. Like, the Bandit's still a hybrid.
Yes.
In some ways, you're kind of, I don't say 2-gapping, but like you're playing more of what Justin Boygby did. You're kind of eating up space a little bit more, but then sometimes you need to get after the passer. And Overton's a little bit thicker because I think he needs to hold up against a run. It's not like you have a Will Anderson or a Dallas Turner at that spot that is 245, 250 pounds, and you're just trying to beat him around the edge. Like, Overton's 270, 280. That's what Latham, I think, played at last year. I think he's probably going to lose some weight to play at Wolf. I don't know if the defense necessarily has a position to fit kind of what your prototypical pass rush body type is, because I think you're kind of asking that Bandit and the Wolf to do some other things kind of based on the situation.
The one guy who I think might be worth watching, it's hard because you don't want to really ask a lot of a true freshman, but Justin Hill, a guy who is a little bit undersized but has a track background, 4-star kid. Maybe he can come in because there's not a lot of those types, it seems, on this roster. Maybe he can be a guy who's a 3rd down pass rush. We've seen under the Saban era a lot of, I remember Rashawn Evans, he got on the field a lot as a true freshman because he did bring that ability. Maybe Justin is a guy who can kind of have a more niche role, but because he has the athleticism, they can kind of turn him loose.
Yeah, I was just reading Gabe Brooks's scouting report on him and mentioned he gained ample reps in a 2-point Y9 alignment that revealed encouraging dip and bend flexibility and arc running juice, which, man, I love how scouts write. Like, damn, it is just great prose. Arc running juice. The Y9 is kind of the part that catches my attention because it's not necessarily what they do in this defense, but that's what I'm talking about. A guy you can kind of put out on the edge and have him kind of beat somebody around the corner as opposed to bull rush them inside.
Yep. Sounds like something Tyler Buckner might write.
The
scouting report there, just the prose that they use for the description and everything.
I respect it.
Yeah, I felt like Mel Kiper. I wanted to get a slice of pumpkin pie and really enjoy that. If you know, you know.
I had the defensive backs. I think there's a couple of questions when it comes to the defensive backs. None that really. I mean, I think the only positional question is probably who starts at Husky, right? Like, if you've got Deshaun Jones, who's going to be there. Red Morgan is back after playing there quite a bit this past season. I think this could also potentially be a spot for a guy like Ivan Taylor to maybe get on the field a little bit earlier. Perhaps Zay Mincy could come down and still use some of his coverage skills in a role like that. I also think Jalen Mbakwe, if the receiver thing doesn't work out, he could potentially pivot back to the secondary and maybe find a home at Husky. That's probably the one positional question. I think the bigger question, at least I had just way too early, is what kind of impact can some of these younger guys make? Because you look at the secondary, Husky's a positional question mark. Just we'll see who ultimately takes over that position probably through the spring. I would think Deshaun Jones probably has the inside track there, just what we saw near the end of last season. But you've also, like, you look at the rest of the secondary, Zabian Brown and Damani Jackson are both back. Bray Hubbard and Keon Sabb are both back. I think they're going to, I know Bray Hubbard took over for Keon Sabb after he got hurt last season, but I think they're going to try and find a way to put those two dudes on the field at the same time. So then you look at the guys behind them, Dijon Lee, who's a 5-star cornerback coming in. How/when is he going to see the field? Can he make an impact? Same thing with Chuck McDonald, the other cornerback. Same thing potentially with Jalen Mbakwe, depending on where maybe he ends up positionally. You look at the safeties. Ivan Taylor's a guy that I think we're all really, really high on. He's got that pedigree. He seems like he's a freak athlete. Zay Mincy has pivoted to safety from corner. Could he play Husky? Is he going to play more safety? Just where do some of these younger guys fit? We saw a lot of rotation, especially early in the season in the secondary, where they got a lot of guys, a lot of snaps. Are they going to do that again this season? If for no other reason than to help build depth, because they kind of know who those frontline starters are. Is this a thing where potentially guys like a Zay Mincy or an Ivan Taylor could push Keon Sabb and Bray Hubbard for some playing time? Could we see a little bit more Red Morgan after he was kind of up and down a little bit as a freshman? Is he going to kind of level out a little bit? I'm very curious to see where some of these younger guys are going to make an impact in the secondary, because they got a lot of talent there. They got, I think, some pretty good depth there. But it's going to probably be kind of hard for some of those younger guys to overtake some of the established starters and veterans that are going to be in the secondary. So what kind of impact can some of those younger guys make? I'm very curious, just at this way too early juncture, what kind, how they'll make an impact, I guess.
Yeah, they definitely need, I mean, I talked about this on the pod and I wrote about it too. They need more production out of the Husky position. That's kind of your wild card in the secondary, a guy you can send on pass rush. And they just didn't get a lot out of it. Devontae was not a liability. Don't get me wrong, but he wasn't making a ton of big plays. Can you get that out of the position, and then how do the pieces fit together? The other interesting kind of subplot to me is, where does Zabian Brown go year 2? Because I thought he played pretty well as a true freshman, made some big plays. His numbers over the course of the year were really strong. Can he step up in a second year like you kind of expect sophomores to do? And you've got a chance to have a really good tandem of starting quarterbacks in Damani and Zabian if that happens, and then sort of you figure out the rest. The good news for all those young guys who were talking about how much do they play this year, the decks will clear a little bit after this next season. So if it doesn't happen right now, it's not the end of the world. But those are the few things I'm watching.
Don't tell guys that college football next year. Next year might as well be 2037.
Yeah, but do you get Cameron Calhoun without that? Like, he's the guy to me. Like, you bring him in from Utah as a starter, starter there. How do you get a guy like that without you're not going to start necessarily this season, are you?
What do you tell Dijon Lee? Because Dijon Lee doesn't start in 2026 because you're starting Cam Calhoun, then you still have Dijon Lee. It's an incredible state of college football, but you have your starting jobs, and then once the music stops and the seats are full there are a lot of other people just scatter. That's kind of how it's turning out these days.
I do wonder if Zabian Brown can become a little bit more of that shutdown guy. I agree. I thought he was great as a freshman. He really only had a couple of games where it's like, okay, like he's getting picked on a little bit. Famously, the Georgia game, right? Like they threw at him multiple times and he ultimately made them pay, right, in the fourth quarter with the game-sealing interception. Zabian Brown taking a step forward. I think Damani Jackson showing us, like I'll admit, like I was not particularly high on him. He impressed me quite a bit. I thought he did very well. And honestly, like what was really impressive about Damani was that I guess early in the season, a lot of teams were going after Zabian Brown. Later in the season, they weren't really going after Zabian Brown as much because they saw how good he was, and they were going after Damani quite a bit more. And he held up. Like he was usually the guy that drew the number one receiver as well. And so now, coming back this year, kind of already feel really good about what Alabama has at cornerback. And so it's, can you solve the Husky position? And then really you're looking at the secondary as a lot of experience, a lot of talent, and really maybe the strength of the defense. Crazy what can happen in a year. We had a lot of questions about the secondary coming into last season. This season, it's like, yeah, like they're going to be really good. So good that they could in fact impact the pass rush a little bit.
According to PFF, Zabian Brown had a better completion percentage than Damani Jackson did.
Yeah.
40.9 versus 52. So, yeah, he got picked on a little bit, but that's why I say over the course of the entire season, he was not a liability. And to say that as a true freshman is pretty impressive.
He was very, very good. I was impressed. So, yeah, that's, can the young guys overtake some of these starters? Maybe not overtake, but just find ways to get on the field a little bit. I'll be curious about their 6 DB package. Who is the 6 DB out there? Is that a space for Dijon Lee? Is that a space for Zay Mincy? Is that a space for Mbakwe? How does he factor into all this? And then also, who starts at Husky? I think that's the big positional question, I think, when it comes to the secondary. Then we should find that out, I think, pretty quickly in spring ball, or at least over the course of the 15 practices. We'll see. In addition to the defensive backs, I also drew defensive coaching staff, since we had a big question on the offensive coaching staff. Felt it was fair to do the same thing with the defense. My question is, what kind of impact can Chuck Morrell make? He was more analyst role, I suppose, last season while Kane coached the inside linebackers, Kane Womack, defensive coordinator. This year, it's going to be Chuck, who's coaching the inside linebackers, while Kane maybe just stays, I guess, kind of big picture defensive coordinator stuff. At least he won't be. I'm sure he'll probably still be hands-on with the linebackers, but what kind of impact can Chuck Morrell make on the defense? I'm very curious to see what that looks like. He's clearly a guy that Kalen trusts. He's been with Kalen since, I believe, their Sioux Fall days, or at least he's been with him for quite a while. He was with him in Washington. Can he do the job better than what Kane did? I think we're all pretty high on just the talent and experience that's going to be in the inside linebacker room. What more can he add to that? I'm just genuinely curious to see what that looks like, because you look at the rest of the defensive staff outside of Hitchler leaving, mostly the same group coming back. So, and it's, that I know that's been kind of a theme that Mike pointed out too, I think probably as early as October. Like, a lot of this defense, they're just kind of running it back with a lot of the same guys, which is good in some cases, like the secondary, but also, okay, we probably need to see a little bit more production, especially from the defensive front. So, what more can this guy add to the linebackers' overall production? I'm curious to see what that looks like.
I agree. The addition of was Jason Jones in the secondary
as an assistant coach too. It's not like a. I don't know.
I'm guessing they probably split up things where it's Maurice is dealing with the corners. Somebody's got to deal with the safeties. Kind of like Chuck, where he was dealing a lot with the inside linebackers, even though he was an analyst. Like, what happens there at the safety position with that coaching change? What happens again? You think about Malachi Moore is almost like a coach on the field. When you lose that guy, how does that affect the alignment? All those things that you sort of take for granted sometimes. Running it back's interesting. I don't think it's the wrong move. I wondered if there'd be a change or two more, but this looks like it's what it's going to be moving forward. And Kane had his moments last year, but they've got to, as we've covered, they've got to answer some questions at some key positions to take a defense that was okay and get it back where Alabama fans think it belongs, which is up near the top of the SEC.
Last position group that we had, not really anything defense related, but special teams related. Mike, you drew this short straw. What is your way too early question regarding Alabama special teams?
I know I intentionally drew this straw because I feel like it's underrated as a topic. The fact that they're losing, I'll start with James Burnip, who has been their punter for the last 4 years and provided stability at a position that some people forget was a revolving door between J.K. Scott and Burnip when he arrived in 2021. And I can remember that being a problem in certain games. Ty Pirine as a walk-on, punting against Tennessee in 2019. Mike Bernier as a walk-on, punting in the bowl game against Michigan because they didn't have anything else. Sam Johnson, a walk-on from Oak Mountain, punting in the season opener, I believe, in 2020. Charlie Scott, the brother of JK, coming as a transfer from Air Force to punt in that 2020 season.
How much further back are you ready to go?
I feel like I'm missing maybe one punter in there.
This is your punter minute on Bama 247.
But there's been games the past couple years where you can make a strong argument that James Burnip was their MVP. He's turned into a very good punter and a guy that has a chance to get drafted this year. We'll have to see what happens, but it's not automatic to just have a guy like that. And, maybe it didn't matter as much back in the day, if you will, 2018, 2019, 2020, when his offense was just going up and down the field and you weren't punting very often, but chances are you're probably going to be punting a little bit more. You have been the last couple of years. So it matters. And you have two options, I think, between Blake Dowd of the Colorado School of Mines coming in as a transfer. And this is a tough name show. Alex Asparov, I believe his name is, coming in as a freshman signee, a scholarship guy. And that term is becoming a little bit more cloudy these days. Yes, with the new rules, but you have a scholarship punter coming in, which you had in Burnip, and just how seamless is that transition? Because there's times when it matters, and there's times when Burnip has done some really good things for this team. And the other part of that is that you're also losing your kicker, and not a guy that they used very often, because I would say one of the big reasons why is because you had Jalen Milroe in the red zone, and that was probably one of his biggest strengths. Was Milroe as a runner in the red zone, was able to score a lot, 20 touchdown runs for Jalen. So you didn't have to kick field goals quite as much. And I don't know how, in terms of how few field goals they kicked, I think it was only 10. And you had Will Reichard before that. So where are you from a kicker standpoint? With Connor Talty, who, by the way, was a guy that went out and got somebody to come in over him last offseason. So, that's a question as well. And you're also losing your long snapper and Nealon Hibbett, who's been here for 4 years and has been very reliable, has been, I don't know, the Manley Award finalist, whatever the hell he was. I can't say I've studied long snappers, but I'm sure they're in their own little world. They have their little rankings, and he's probably right up there in terms of one of the better ones in college football. You're losing all three of those guys, and you're going to have some young players in there. So that's obviously a question, and it's not something we're probably going to talk about or think about. But when you have a missed field goal in a key game, or you shank punt, or whatever the case may be, like, people will be talking about it, or a bad snap, or whatever it is. So it's a sneaky one, but you're losing a lot among your special teams. All three of your specialists being gone in one offseason is not unique, but it's probably rare.
Two quick thoughts to add there. First off, kind of surprised Mike hasn't grinded the film on long snappers. I expect better of you.
Yeah, Carson Tinker would like a word.
Two, I honestly think Connor Talty will be fine because they had him handle kickoffs this past season. And I believe DeBoer, we asked him one time, maybe not us specifically, but just the Alabama Media Corps asked him if there was a point in time where he considered Connor Talty for longer field goals because Graham Nicholson's range was just kind of limited, I think, to right about 50 or just under 50 yards. And Connor Talty he obviously did pretty well handling kickoffs this past year, kicked a lot of them, if not all of them, out of the back of the end zone. So maybe a little bit of a stronger leg there. So I kind of excited to see him take over kicking duties, but also, yeah, like Mike makes a fair point. Like there's a lot of question marks on special teams, and we've seen time and again how crucial that the third phase of the game that doesn't often get talked about can decide a game for better or for worse. So good point to bring it up now.
Yeah, you don't want to take it for granted. At the same time, was the special teams that special this past year? There were no big plays. There were no block punts, no block kicks, no touchdowns. There were some shaky returns.
There were moments like the bowl game. Ryan Williams' punt return gave them the opportunity to drive down the field and potentially they didn't win the game, but without that punt return, I'm not sure where that offense is going. And also,
final 2 minutes of the season, they showed up.
Moments. Moments.
If you can get more out of that, there have been other teams, including a team in Columbia, South Carolina, that figures out a way to make that a weapon that's at their disposal. So you're not relying on your offense to score all the time and put you in good field position. It's hard to do. That's why everybody doesn't do it. But if you can figure out that piece of it and create some momentum plays where they didn't really have those this past year, I think that's an area where they can really steal a game potentially, I think. So, yes, they've got issues they've got to solve. The burn-up thing is more of a worry for me the more I think about it. But it's not as if Graham Nicholson was the biggest weapon in the world they were using as a field goal kicker because of the range, because of what Milroe did in the red zone, and then the lack of big plays. I think there is an opportunity to gain some on that special teams as well. That's kind of, I'm not saying it's automatically a weakness, but I think there's opportunity for gain as well because they did not make a ton of big plays. You just don't want to let the things you take for granted dip.
Yes, I agree with that. That was the special teams minute. A lot of minutes on this podcast. So that is, but that was really all I had on the docket to discuss today, guys. We will be back later this week. I'll be in Starkville on Wednesday for basketball. Alex is going to make his way down to Mobile for the Senior Bowl, where Jalen Milroe figures to probably be one of the stars of the show this week. Also, I believe Kalen DeBoer will be making an appearance down there. So you guys can look forward to that. Mike will probably listen to another podcast featuring Nick Saban. So we're all going to be we're all going to be quite busy this week. So we'll be back at some point later in the week to discuss a handful of those things, if not more, and other stuff, whatever pops up this week. So we'll continue the quote unquote off-season podcast machine. In the meantime, though, be sure to rate and review this show wherever you listen to your podcast, Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, even our Bama 247 YouTube page. Subscribe to Bama 247 and 24/7 Sports. It is the off season, but clearly still a very busy offseason for Alabama, whether it's football, basketball. So you can get all of our great coverage of the Crimson Tide at Bama 247. So as always, we appreciate you guys for listening. We will talk to you all again soon.